Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever tried to navigate the online world today? Maybe you're looking for reliable information or you're just trying to share, a perspective or an observation, and it feels, well, turbulent.
Oh, definitely. Turbulent is a good word for it.
Like you hit unexpected resistance. Maybe you feel your words aren't quite reaching who you thought they would, or perhaps you even find yourself facing actual limitations.
That feeling is incredibly common right now, I think. It could definitely feel less like a free-flowing exchange of ideas and more like trying to um, steer a small boat through really choppy waters,
Yeah.
especially when the ideas you're trying to share might genuinely challenge, the prevailing winds of a particular online community or platform.
Exactly, that feeling of encountering friction, right? Of having your reach limited, or maybe even finding yourself effectively silenced within a space where you're supposed to be a member.
Mm-hmm.
Well, today we are diving deep into a stack of sources you've shared that look at just that experience. Specifically, the experience of publishing what one author calls heterodox thought online.
It's seen through a fascinating and really powerful lens,
Yeah.
systems thinking.
Yes, our core source today is a piece titled Finding a Port in the Storm, Choosing a Platform for Heterodox Thought. It's by William L. Weaver, and it details his personal journey, his observations about navigating this whole online landscape. But we won't stop there.
Right?
We're going to use his broader work on systems, drawing heavily from the insights in a standard model for systems, and particularly the fortress and the shifting sands, to try and understand the deeper dynamics at play here.
So our mission then is to really unpack Weaver's personal account, this business of returning to online publishing and hitting that friction.
Yeah, that turbulence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then use his own systems framework, these really insightful concepts like systemic coherence, which he actually calls beauty, which is interesting.
It is, yeah.
And the specific dynamics of systems that resist challenging ideas, which he gets into in The Fortress and the Shifting Sands.
We want to understand systemically why online platforms might resist challenging ideas from their own members, what the consequences are when they do that, and maybe what a more resilient approach might look like.
It's really about making that connection, isn't it? Between that very personal, sometimes really frustrating online experience
Yeah.
and these, well, they seem abstract, but they're incredibly clarifying concepts from systems theory. Why does this friction happen? How does it actually function within the system of the platform itself?
I think seeing this through a systems lens can offer some powerful aha moments.
Yeah.
Definitely. So let's jump right in with the core narrative from Finding a Port in the Storm. Weaver talks about his decision to return to regular online publishing after being away for a bit. What was the driving force there?
Well, he frames it very much from the perspective of being a scientist. He's got over 30 years of experience.
Okay.
And for him, writing isn't just, putting words down. It's a vital, inseparable part of the scientific process itself.
Uh-huh.
It's how you consolidate learning, how you summarize experiences and data, how you actually draw conclusions from your observations, and importantly, how you contribute back to the collective pool of knowledge. It's essential, really, for his own continued learning and his ability to contribute meaningfully.
So it's not just like a casual activity or a hobby for him. It's almost like a professional obligation.
Yeah.
Or part of his methodology for doing science.
Exactly. It's integral to his practice. And central to that, he emphasizes, is this principle: making thoughtful, honest observations based on evidence and rigorous analysis.
Okay, that sounds reasonable.
Right. But here's the crucial part that leads to that whole turbulent experience.
Uh-huh.
Doing so, even and especially when those observations might run counter to prevailing cultural themes or, the dominant narratives within a particular online space. This commitment to what he explicitly labels heterodoxy, holding views or opinions contrary to generally accepted beliefs, that's really the root of the challenge he documents.
Okay, so he's returning to share evidence-based insights grounded in his scientific work, but he knows they might be unconventional or challenge the status quo in certain online communities. How has that actually gone for him historically on different platforms? The source describes it as somewhat turbulent.
Yeah, somewhat turbulent is maybe putting it mildly. He doesn't shy away from detailing a history of friction across several major platforms that, well, many of us use daily: Twitter,
Yeah.
Facebook, LinkedIn,
Right.
Medium.
Familiar names.
And the friction wasn't just like mild disagreement in the comments. It manifested, as he describes it, as experiencing actual bans,
Wow.
significant limitations on what he could do or say, and importantly, muted reach.
Muted reach, what does that mean exactly?
It means his posts just weren't being seen by as many people as you might expect given his network size or the platform structure, like the algorithm was somehow dialing things down.
Okay, so bans, limitations, muted reach on multiple big platforms. That certainly sounds like the platforms were in some way actively interfering with the dissemination of his ideas, even if those ideas were grounded in his expertise.
That is absolutely the perception documented in the source, yeah.
Okay.
And it's a key part of his motivation for looking for a different kind of platform later on.
Did you give any specific examples?
He did. He mentions Medium specifically. Comments he made there, which he describes as explicitly grounded in my understanding but challenging accepted viewpoints at the time.
Right.
They were met with significant resistance. And he adds this really interesting detail that those views he shared, the ones that caused all the friction at the time, they were actually later validated.
Oh, that's fascinating. So it wasn't necessarily that the views were wrong or harmful in the long run?
Not according to him, no.
But they just challenged what was the accepted norm at that specific moment on that platform. The resistance was to the heterodoxy itself, the challenge to the current consensus, not necessarily its ultimate truthfulness.
Precisely. The system, you could say, reacted to the perceived challenge to its current state, its current coherence.
What about LinkedIn? You mentioned that too. He notes having a large professional network there, but still felt his reach was muted. That seems different from an outright ban.
It does feel different, yeah. More subtle, perhaps, maybe algorithmic.
Right.
He speculates that this muted reach, even within a relevant professional network, might reflect the underlying platform culture. Or maybe the algorithms prioritize certain types of interaction or content over potentially disruptive views, even if they're well-reasoned and professionally grounded.
So if the platform's implicit goals or its design subtly penalize content that deviates too much from the expected norm,
then it can effectively suppress heterodoxy without any explicit moderation action, like a ban. It becomes a kind of systemic filtering. The system just routes around it, maybe?
Okay. So this whole history, experiencing these different forms of resistance across different platforms, that clearly framed his decision process when he was looking for a new home for his writing, around April 2025, I think the source said.
It absolutely did. His core question, the one driving his evaluation of platforms like Medium and eventually Substack, became, which platform is going to best support the publication of these potentially controversial or heterodox ideas derived from scientific observation without what he terms undue platform interference.
Undue platform interference, yeah. And he emphasizes again that his goal wasn't profitation just for the sake of it.
And not all. He's very clear on that. His goal was simply to honestly report observations and conclusions derived from a scientific perspective. This really highlights that perceived mismatch. His intent was just rigorous scientific communication, but the platform's responses felt like censorship or suppression because the scientifically grounded views were heterodox, because they challenged the system's current state or narrative.
That personal experience encountering friction when you're just trying to share challenging ideas, honestly, I think that's incredibly relatable for a lot of people online today.
I agree.
But let's shift now. Let's look at this through that lens you mentioned, systems thinking. How can we understand systemically why this resistance to heterodoxy might happen on platforms, especially when it comes from someone who's already a member of that system?
This is really where William Weaver's broader work becomes so powerful, I think. His standard model for systems provides a framework, a way of thinking that can help us analyze complex realities. And that includes social phenomena like online communities and the platforms that host them.
And he positions these online communities and social platforms within that model's hierarchy of complexity, doesn't he?
Yes, specifically as Tier 3 systems. These are human and social systems, which he argues are the most complex level in his model.
What makes Tier 3 systems particularly complex according to that source? What's different about them?
Well, they involve incredibly intricate interactions between individuals. Unlike simpler systems like, say, mechanical or even biological ones. They operate at a level where consciousness, culture, values, shared norms, and maybe most importantly, human choice and agency are dominant factors.
Right. People making decisions.
Exactly. This isn't just physics or chemistry playing out. It's the realm of deliberation, meaning-making, shared stories, and emergent collective behavior. When you have millions of humans interacting on a platform, you're definitely dealing with complexity at Tier 3.
And his 10 systems thoughts.
Yeah.
Those are like fundamental lenses for understanding these complex
They
systems.
are, yeah. They provide different angles of insight into how these systems function, why they behave the way they do. We can use a few of them now to analyze the dynamics that led to the kind of friction Weaver experienced.
Okay, sounds good. Let's deep dive into one specific system thought that feels especially relevant to platforms and communities. Art is the study of membership, outputting beauty. Now, this one can sound a bit abstract, maybe even counterintuitive at first. How does art study membership?
It does sound a bit strange, doesn't it? If you think of art only in terms of, like, subjective painting or sculpture.
Yeah.
But the source redefines these terms within a specific systemic context. Membership here isn't just about being present in a system, like physically being there. It's defined as how individuals or elements are connected, how they relate to each other to form a coherent whole.
Okay, so like the difference between just throwing a bunch of random items into a box, a junk drawer, as the source puts it,
Right, the junk drawer analogy.
where they're all together but have no real functional connection, versus, say, the components of an engine or a biological organism, where the parts have specific relationships and work together for a larger purpose.
Exactly that. The parts of a system belong together in a functional or meaningful way. Their relationships, their connections, create something larger than just the sum of the parts. Art, in this systemic view, is presented as a way of exploring the nature of these connections, how things fit together, how they relate, how they belong, or perhaps how they could belong. Think about how a composer arranges notes and instruments in a symphony, or how a choreographer organizes dancers in space. They are literally creating and exploring relationships that build a coherent, meaningful whole.
So art, across its various forms, is fundamentally about exploring relationships, composition, structure, how elements are brought into coherence, or maybe even how they reveal a lack of coherence.
Yes, precisely. It's a study of the relational structure that creates unity or meaning within a collection of parts. And this leads directly to the systemic definition of beauty.
Okay, let's talk about beauty then, because that's not usually how we think about systems.
Right. In this framework, beauty is not subjective prettiness or just a matter of taste. The source defines systemic beauty as the currency connecting disparate elements into a harmonious whole.
The currency connecting them.
Yeah, it's described as the unifying force, the coherence, the integration that transforms a mere collection of parts into a meaningful integrated system.
So beauty, systemically, is like a measure of how well the elements of a system are connected, how effectively that membership is established, and how well it functions together to create a coherent whole.
That's precisely it. Systems with high degrees of successful membership and effective integration exhibit systemic beauty. The source uses examples like a perfectly executed symphony, an elegant painting, a complex dance, a beautifully engineered machine, or even well-structured, elegant code.
Okay, I can see that in engineering or code. Elegance is definitely a thing there.
Exactly. They are perceived as beautiful in this systemic context because they display a high degree of coherence. Their elements are strongly, meaningfully, and effectively connected to form an integrated whole. Conversely, something disjointed, chaotic, or with parts that don't fit together or actively work against each other. That's ugly in this systemic sense.
Ugly meaning poor membership.
Yes, signaling poor or failed membership and integration, low coherence.
Okay, the application to platforms is becoming clearer now. Online platforms are fundamentally systems made up of connected individuals, their members.
Right.
So the platform's structure, its rules, its norms, the kind of discourse it encourages or suppresses, its algorithms, all of these are mechanisms that shape the nature of that membership. They determine the system's beauty or coherence.
Exactly. A platform operator, or maybe just the platform's emergent design, is implicitly or explicitly pursuing a form of systemic beauty. They're trying to define and enforce the nature of membership within its boundaries.
How so?
Well, they want the system of users and content to cohere in a certain way. Maybe they want it to be a really supportive community, or maybe an efficient information marketplace, or perhaps a place for rapid-fire debate. The rules and the algorithms are like the composition tools they use to aim for that specific kind of systemic beauty.
This is where Weaver's personal experience of friction in finding a port in the storm starts to connect directly to the dynamics described in The Fortress and the Shifting Sands, isn't it?
It really does.
If a platform is trying to maintain a certain coherence, a certain beauty, how does it tend to react when a member introduces something that challenges that established order or coherence, like heterodox thought?
This brings us right to the concept of nearly decomposable systems, or NDS. These are characterized in The Fortress and the Shifting Sands as being like fortresses.
Fortresses, okay. What defines a fortress system?
They typically have very strong internal connections within their components, but relatively weaker or more resistant links between those components and, crucially, to the outside environment.
So they're really good at optimizing what happens inside their walls, maximizing internal efficiency and coherence.
Yes, exactly. They build robust internal structures and interactions. This provides significant internal efficiency and resilience, but
Right.
primarily in a stable, predictable environment. That stability part is key.
And social systems, including online platforms and the communities within them, they can develop these fortress characteristics.
They absolutely can and often do. The source explains that social systems build up shared stories, shared norms, ways of thinking, specific ways to validate information. They develop strong internal bonds and communication channels.
Okay.
They can become very cohesive, sometimes functioning like echo chambers, really, where information that confirms the existing view confirms the established beauty or current coherence of the system gets amplified. Those are the strong internal links at work.
Right, and heterodox information, or anything that challenges that established view or norm, even slightly, how is that treated by the fortress?
Well, that gets treated very differently. It's often seen as a perceived external disturbance, even if it originates from within the system by one of its own members.
Ah, that's critical. It's treated as outside, even if it's inside.
Yes, because it's information that doesn't fit the pattern of the existing internal beauty. As the source describes in the context of fortresses, such challenging information is often filtered, dismissed, maybe actively resisted. These represent the weak or resistant external couplings, or in this case, internal but treated as external couplings. The system's internal cohesion, its fortress mentality, which is focused on maintaining its current state, drives it to resist or filter input that challenges that state. It fights against sensing or integrating crucial outside information, even when that information is coming from within its own boundaries, from its own members.
So the friction weaver experienced the moderation actions, the muting of reach. The bands could be seen as the social system of the platform acting like a fortress, defending itself against perceived internal disruption, protecting its established beauty.
That is precisely the systemic interpretation offered by connecting these sources. And it aligns very strongly with the specific focus you mentioned earlier. The platform's content moderation policies, its algorithms, its community norms, they can all function as the system's defense mechanism.
Like an immune system.
Exactly like an immune system. That's a very apt analogy, and it's right there in the focus notes. The system identifies something originating within itself, the heterodox thought from a member, as potentially foreign or threatening to its established healthy internal state.
And it sends out the guardians.
Right, the moderation algorithms or human reviewers acting like the white blood cells to try and encapsulate that offending thought.
And then
Just like an immune system tries to filter out captured bacteria or viruses, the platform tries to limit the reach of the information through muting or shadow banning. Or, in more extreme cases, it effectively disenrolls the member from the social system entirely by canceling their account, banning them. It neutralizes the perceived threat to coherence.
So it's applying an optimized internal response, like the kata analogy from the source, the pre-practice martial arts form.
Exactly that kata analogy.
It's applying that optimized response to maintain its current form and state of beauty.
Precisely. The kata represents the highly optimized, efficient response designed for a specific expected situation. The platform's moderation system, in this analogy, is that optimized response mechanism for maintaining a certain type of discourse or achieving a specific kind of community coherence. But if a member introduces novel, challenging input that the kata wasn't designed for, like that martial artist facing an opponent whose attack isn't the one they've practiced against, applying that rigid, optimized internal response isn't suited for integrating the new information. Whether that information comes from the evolving external environment or from the diverse reality present within its own membership, it resists processing input that doesn't fit its pre-programmed pattern or its established model of internal coherence, its beauty.
But the fortress and the shifting sands also carries a pretty strong warning about this kind of inward focus and resistance to new input, doesn't it? What happens if the environment isn't stable? If the sands are shifting, as the title suggests?
That's the critical vulnerability these fortress systems face. The danger for closed, inward-focused NDS, the fortresses, is that the environment inevitably changes around them. And that makes their highly optimized internal structure and their rigid response mechanisms increasingly irrelevant or even actively detrimental.
And what's the consequence for social systems like online platforms that filter out challenging information, especially, again, when it comes from their own members who might actually have valuable insights?
They become, in the source's rather stark words, dangerously blind.
Dangerously blind.
Yeah. By filtering out valid, evidence-based heterodox views originating from within their own membership, people who are, by definition, inside the system, and potentially have access to valuable internal or environmental information. These platforms prevent themselves from receiving essential sensory input about the real-world environment and input about the diverse perspectives that actually exist within their own community. They fail to adapt to changing realities. They experience a growing disconnect from reality as it evolves.
And the outcomes.
The potential outcomes described in the source are pretty severe. Stagnation, decline, or eventually maybe disruptive upheaval or revolution. Systemically, it leads to cultural calcification.
Wow. Cultural calcification. So they become optimized for internal agreement and a narrow, static sense of beauty, a very specific, unchanging kind of coherence. But they risk becoming like that martial artist's perfect but useless kata against an unexpected opponent. Or the programmer's elegant but totally outdated framework. They become, what was the phrase? A beautifully constructed relic perfectly adapted to a world that no longer exists.
Precisely that. And the root cause, as highlighted again in Fortress, is an underdeveloped or maybe just ignored sensory apparatus. It's an unwillingness to look outside the fortress walls.
Or inside, if the inside view is challenging.
Exactly. And crucially, in the case of these social systems, it's an unwillingness to acknowledge or properly process input from within its own members if that input challenges the internal model or the established beauty. That fundamental flow that healthy systems rely on environment leads to data, gets processed by transducers into information, informs the model, builds knowledge, guides choice action. That flow gets broken really early on. Because the system resists the incoming data or information if it's heterodox, if it doesn't fit the established picture or threatens the current internal coherence. The members are trying to provide data and information from the environment, the real world, different perspectives. But the platform's transducers, its algorithms, its rules, its moderators filter it out because it doesn't match the existing model.
So it's prioritizing maintaining its current internal beauty, its established coherence, over integrating the diverse input even from its own components, its members that could actually keep it healthy, adaptive, and relevant in a dynamic world.
Exactly. There's a strong sense in the source material that while a fortress might be designed to, bulwark itself against genuine external threats, like actual hate speech originating outside or trying to infiltrate.
Sure, that's important too.
Absolutely. But the danger really arises when its rigid defense mechanisms start treating valid, evidence-based heterodox information coming from certified, experienced members inside the system the same way it treats those external threats.
So it throws the baby out with the bathwater, in a sense.
In a way, yes. By fighting against potentially valuable input from within, it risks calcifying from the inside out. It's attempting to create this perfect, stable internal state, but it comes at the cost of vital sensory connection to reality, both external and internal.
That's a really powerful reframing. It makes you see content moderation not just as, policing bad actors, but as potentially impacting the systemic health and adaptability of the platform itself.
Yeah, really does.
So what's the alternative? Does Fortress and the Shifting Sands just describe the problem, or does it suggest a more resilient model?
No, it definitely suggests an alternative.
Yeah.
It talks about the Open NDS.
Open NDS. Okay. How is that different?
Well, this system still benefits from internal structure and efficiency. It's not suggesting pure chaos.
Right.
But it fundamentally actively invests in its sensors. It's constantly gathering and trying to make sense of information from its environment. And critically, it retains the power, the agency, to change its internal structures or responses based on what it learns from the outside. And that includes learning from potentially challenging input from its own components, its members.
So an open social platform wouldn't automatically filter out heterodox information from its members. It would actually value it as crucial sensory input for adaptation.
That's the core idea, yes. It would see this diverse data, even if it's challenging or uncomfortable for the current state, as essential for informing a system's understanding of itself and its environment. It's not something to be suppressed just to maintain a static internal beauty. It's something to be integrated somehow, to allow for adaptive choices and prevent that blindness and calcification we talked about. The health of the system, its long-term survival, depends on its ability to sense widely and accurately.
Okay. And connecting this back to Weaver's choice of Substack in finding a port in the storm, how does that platform's approach, as he describes it in the source, align with this open NDS idea?
Well, he highlights Substack's philosophy, particularly the emphasis it places on reader judgment via the unsubscribe button.
Ah, the unsubscribe button.
Yeah. This is presented as a key differentiator because it places the primary filtering mechanism in the hands of the individual members, the readers, rather than relying solely on the system itself, the platform's central moderation or algorithms, to enforce a single standard of coherence or beauty by filtering content based on some potentially rigid internal model.
Ah, okay. So the heterodox information can still exist on the platform. It can still reach members who choose to engage with it, who essentially tune their own sensors to receive it.
Precisely. This approach, as described by Weaver anyway, preserves the potential for heterodox information to exist within the broader system of Substack. It allows it to inform those members who are open to it. It allows the system's collective understanding, the whole network of connections and information flow, to be potentially informed, challenged, and diversified by heterodox viewpoints.
Instead of being locked into a single, centrally enforced narrative or a static definition of beauty?
Exactly. The filtering happens more at the periphery by conscious individual choice. I'll subscribe to this, not that, rather than centrally by a system potentially acting as a fortress, trying to keep everything internally consistent according to one definition.
So in a way, maybe this allows for a more dynamic, more resilient, and perhaps ultimately a higher form of systemic beauty, one that embraces complexity.
Yes, I think that's exactly the implication.
Yeah.
If we re-examine that idea, art is the study of membership, outputting beauty, through the lens of this open NDS model, then the beauty or coherence of the system isn't about rigid uniformity or suppressing difference. True, robust coherence and integration, the real systemic beauty, might actually come not from filtering out diversity to maintain a static, simple structure, but from successfully integrating diverse, sometimes challenging elements and perspectives from the system's members into a more complex, adaptive, and reality-attuned whole.
It's a form of beauty built on dynamic integration rather than static exclusion.
Well put, yes.
Okay, let's try and pull all these threads together now. We started with that very real, very relatable experience of encountering friction when trying to publish challenging or heterodox ideas online, as detailed in Finding a Port in the Storm.
That personal account.
And we used William Weaver's really powerful systems framework, drawing on concepts from his standard model, that really profound idea that art is the study of membership, outputting beauty, and the dynamics described in The Fortress and The Shifting Sands.
Right, using those systems' lenses.
We saw how online platforms functioning as these complex Tier 3 human systems can start to act like fortresses. They optimize for internal coherence, a specific kind of systemic beauty.
Yeah, their particular version of it.
And in doing so, they can resist perceived disturbances like heterodox thought, particularly when it comes from their own members. We explored how moderation and algorithmic filtering can act almost like an immune system.
Right, the white blood cells analogy.
Attempting to neutralize or remove input that doesn't fit the established internal pattern, the current beauty.
And we identified the significant risk this poses, drawing heavily from The Fortress and The Shifting Sands. That risk of calcification, irrelevance, and a dangerous disconnect from a changing reality.
Yeah.
Because the system is filtering out essential sensory input, not just from the external environment, crucially, from the diverse reality represented by its own members.
Yeah.
By prioritizing a static internal beauty, it risks losing the ability to adapt, to evolve.
And finally, we looked at the potential of a more open approach, like the open NDS model, and how Weaver found something appealing in Substack's model, perhaps related to this, where the system allows for the existence and potential integration of diverse, even challenging information, maybe by placing more filtering power with individual members.
Allowing those heterodox views to potentially act as vital input for adaptation rather than simply something to be suppressed by the central system to maintain order.
So the central message, really synthesizing these sources, seems to be that social systems, whether they're online platforms or organizations or communities we're part of, they risk becoming these irrelevant fortresses if they systematically filter out challenging information, especially when that information comes from their own certified and experienced members.
Right. And balancing that need for internal coherence, that sense of beauty or shared membership, with genuine external awareness, and, critically, the willingness to integrate diverse, even difficult inputs.
Yeah.
That seems absolutely key to their long-term health, their resilience, and their continued relevance in a world that's always changing.
This has definitely given me a whole new way to look at not just my online interactions, but really any group or organization I'm a part of. It's not just about individual disagreements anymore. It's about the systemic dynamics of how information, especially challenging information, gets processed or resisted.
It truly shifts the focus, doesn't it? From just looking at individual content disputes to examining the structural behavior and the overall health of the system itself. Is it learning? Is it adapting? Or is it closing itself off?
Yeah. So here is a provocative thought maybe for you, the listener, to carry forward from this deep dive today. Think about the systems you are a part of in your own life, that online community you frequent, maybe your workplace team, a club you belong to, perhaps even family dynamics sometimes. How do these systems handle challenging or heterodox information that comes from their own members?
Do they tend to act like fortresses? Do they send out those guardians, maybe subtle social pressure, maybe more overt filtering to maintain a rigid, perhaps static internal coherence and beauty?
Or do they have windows and doors open? Do they actively seek to understand and maybe even integrate diverse input, allowing for a more dynamic, maybe more complex, but ultimately more resilient form of systemic beauty and health to emerge?
How does that dynamic, how the system processes or fails to process input from its own members, impact the coherence, the beauty in that systemic sense, and the long-term health and relevance of those systems you're in?
It definitely gives you something to consider the next time you encounter resistance, or just observe how information flows, or perhaps doesn't flow, within a group you belong to.